Well, hey, everybody, good morning to you. Happy Sunday to you. Happy August to you. Thanks for being here. I'm really glad that you're here today. You know, our church is a little over 19 years old. We held our first official service on March 5th of 2006. And heading into the launch of CCC, I was a little nervous about the idea of preaching every week. Like, it's something I hadn't done up until that point. I'd certainly preached often enough, but not regularly, like week after week after week. And I remember heading into week one, feeling a bit nervous about it all, and I wanted to run through my message, like to speak it to someone. And so a day or two before we were set to launch the church, I went to my wife, Melanie, and I said, "Hey, honey, could I preach my message to you? Like, go over it, sort of thing." And she was like, "Sure." And beside our bed in our bedroom, we had this chair and a table, and she laid down on the bed, and I started to run through the very first sermon I was going to give for this new church we were launching to sort of ease my nerves. Well, lo and behold, I probably made it through maybe 10 minutes of that thing, and Melanie was out cold. Like, she had fallen asleep, which didn't do a whole lot to calm my nerves, let me tell you. You know, the next week I wanted to run through it again, so I went to Melanie again, and I asked her if she wouldn't mind listening to my message again, and she said, "Absolutely, like anything for you, go for it." She laid down on the bed, and I sat in that chair beside our bed with the table, and this time she made it maybe 5 minutes before she started snoozing, which again was not doing a whole lot for my confidence, you know, heading into Sunday morning. Well, week 3 rolled around, and I went to Melanie again and asked her if she'd listen to my message, and she was like, "Without a doubt, anything for you, baby." And by this time, my expectations were pretty low for the run-through. I'm not sure exactly what I was expecting. I think I may have suggested that she sit up in bed. Maybe that would help. And wouldn't you know it, but she made it all the way through that run through heading into week 3. And she was pretty excited about the fact that she listened all the way to the end without falling asleep. In fact, she said to me, "Since I made it through the whole message, do I have to go to church tomorrow?" Which once again did not infuse me with a great deal of confidence as I approached the Sunday morning. After that, I figured I should come up with a different system for running through the message, because I really needed a bit of confidence heading into this task of delivering a sermon each and every Sunday. Now, the Apostle Paul, he wasn't like that at all. The Apostle Paul, whose life and story we've been looking at all summer long, he didn't lack confidence at all. He didn't lack courage at all. He was ready at any time, at the drop of a hat, to preach full on to an arena full of people. And he did on numerous occasions. We looked at a couple of those instances, because he was a gifted, talented, really sharp man with a sharp mind. And his life was an incredible ride, like starting churches and preaching and developing leaders and defending the gospel of Jesus Christ all over the first century world. But listen, any extended look at the life and the story of the Apostle Paul really requires some serious thought about the subject of pain and suffering, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now, pain and suffering are not very pleasant subjects to explore, especially in our particular culture. Like, we're pushed to think that if pain and suffering, you know, if we experience it in our life, it can't possibly be from God, that God actually wants his followers to live a pain-free life, a life of comfort and happiness and ease. And if we're experiencing any kind of pain and suffering, then it's from the evil one, it's from the devil. The problem with that sort of thinking is it's neither true nor biblical. That although the devil is responsible for a whole lot of the struggle in our world and in our lives, he's not always the one responsible for the pain and suffering in our lives. And so it may surprise us to hear that there are times when pain comes as a part of God's sovereign plan to prepare us in some sort of way. And our theology gets a little fuzzy here in our country because of our addiction to comfort. It was the pastor and theologian Helmut Thielicke who, after an extended visit to the United States, when he was asked what he believed was the greatest defect among American Christians, and he said they have an inadequate view of suffering. And so we here in our country, in our culture, we need to grow in this arena, which brings us back to Paul. Because a day rarely went by in Paul's life when he didn't face intense pain and suffering and struggle and hardship. And fortunately, he lets us in on his experience through his writing. In fact, the book of 2 Corinthians in the Bible, which Paul wrote to the Corinthian Christians, this Corinthian church that he started, it's probably the most autobiographical of all the letters that he wrote. And although most of his letters that he penned to young churches, they're filled with passion and conviction, none of them demonstrates a level of vulnerability and depth of emotion that Corinthians does. Check it out, 2 Corinthians, the very first chapter, verse 3, this is what he writes. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. Now, I know that's a mouthful, all right? But here's what he's saying. Specific pain enables us to comfort others specifically. And like, you get this. If you've ever gone through some difficulty, God can use you in the life of another person as they go through that same difficulty. You're able to comfort with the same comfort with which you were comforted when you were going through it. So like, if you've ever struggled through a terrible divorce, nobody understands you like a friend who's been through a divorce before. If you've ever gone through the loss of somebody that you love, you know, a parent or a spouse or a child, then God can use you in the life of somebody else as they're experiencing that same kind of pain. If you've received a bad medical test result, like, you can understand intimately the emotions and the fears a friend of yours goes through when they get a similar test result. Like, that's how it works. That's how God works sometimes. As many of you might remember, at the end of May, I had rotator cuff surgery on my right shoulder to repair a rotator cuff tear. And so for several weeks, 6 weeks or so, I was in a shoulder harness because the doctor wanted to immobilize my shoulder because I had a screw inserted into my shoulder. It was really a suture anchor that they embed into the bone to reattach the torn tendon to the humerus bone. I actually have a picture of the x-ray of the follow-up visit I had right after my surgery. This is the x-ray of my shoulder with that screw embedded in there. I actually have a picture of the shoulder before the x-ray. This is the picture of my shoulder. And then the x-ray there, go back to that. That's the x-ray with the screw inserted. You don't know. And what they want you to do is they want you to wear this harness to immobilize the shoulder so that screw can adhere to the bone and be secure. Now, if you're around CCC 6 or 7 years ago, I had the same procedure done on my left shoulder to repair a really bad torn rotator cuff on my left side. And I have 4 anchors in this shoulder over here. It's in really bad shape. Well, I've been trying to protect my right shoulder since I ditched the harness, because it's no indicator that I've had something done. And I've done this with many of you before. I'll see you, and you extend your right hand, and I will shake your hand with my left hand. In fact, I may do that today if we see each other after service. But one morning, several weeks ago, we were having some work done out back of our house, and a crew of guys came by, and I went out to meet the guy who was in charge of this crew, and he introduced himself, and he extended his right hand to me, and I said, hey, I'm going to shake with my left hand because I had some surgery on my shoulder this past spring. And he said, oh, really? So did I. And I said, I had shoulder surgery back in May. When did you have shoulder surgery? He said, I had shoulder surgery in April. I was like, oh. I said, well, what shoulder surgery did you have? And he said, I had rotator cuff surgery. And I said, I had rotator cuff surgery too. I said, I had a screw put in my shoulder. Do you also have a screw? Did they put a screw in your shoulder? And he said, no. They put 7 screws in my shoulder. I know. I was like, 7 screws in your shoulder? That's crazy. You must have set a record. Like, that's crazy. How did that come about? And I'm telling you, we talked in my driveway for about an hour and a half about shoulders. Like the crew who came to do this work at my house, they're just standing in my backyard waiting for us as we, we're like long lost shoulder brothers or something. And I was like, this guy gets me, he understands me. Because listen, if you've ever gone through something, difficult or otherwise, nobody gets you like somebody who's experienced the same thing. And that's what Paul is saying here in those first few verses. Sometimes God will use the greatest point of pain in your life to help and serve and comfort other people. Now, a few verses later there in the first chapter of 2 Corinthians, Paul gets more specific with how much difficulty he faced and how God actually comforted him. In verse 8, he writes this, "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of our affliction which came to us, that we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despaired of life." Now, think about this. Paul, the Apostle Paul, the man God used so mightily, despaired of life. I mean, there was a time, maybe even several times, when Paul suffered such a depth of depression that he no longer wanted to live. He wasn't sure if he was going to make it through. But God held him together. He actually says in verse 9, he says, "Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves in order that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raised us the dead. In my despairing life, I learned to trust, and God showed me his remarkable power, the same power he used to raise his son Jesus from the grave." Now, Paul keeps going, kind of describing what he went through in his life and his ministry. In chapter 4, verse 8, he says this, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed." All right, now think about this. Afflicted, persecuted, crushed, struck down. That was Paul's life in a nutshell. That was the hand that he was dealt. And if that wasn't enough, Paul says, wait till I get going. Because he says in chapter 6, "But in everything, commending ourselves as servants of God in much endurance and afflictions and hardships and distresses and beatings and imprisonments and riots and labors and sleeplessness and hunger." And just for good measure, in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, he continues this. He says, 5 times I received the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brothers. I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. You get the picture here. My good night. Paul was put through the ringer. It is crazy, everything that he went through. Now, remarkably, despite all that he endured, he didn't really brag about his ability to, face enormous odds with incredible courage, or about his physical stamina or his emotional stability. He didn't testify to any of that. Instead, he says this in chapter 11, verse 30. He says, "If I have to boast, I'll boast of what pertains to my weakness." Now, we read that and we think, what are you talking about? Boasting in weakness. What is that? Well, he learned to glory in suffering without retaining in his soul an ounce of blame or bitterness toward the Lord. And that, my friends, is something that we got to grasp, because we blame God all the time. With all the abuse, the defection of friends, the persecution from synagogue leaders, how is it that Paul didn't retaliate? How did he not lash out at these opponents of his or at the Lord? Why didn't he shake his fist at God and say, what's the deal with all this, God? He didn't do that. And I think the reason that he didn't do that is because of what he learned and a remarkable vision that he experienced, which he happens to describe in the same letter to the Corinthian church in the very next chapter, chapter 12. And I want us to check it out. It's an amazing scene, one of the more incredible experiences anybody ever had in the Bible. And here's what happened. For a lot of reasons, Paul had to actually defend his authority as an apostle of Jesus Christ. And as part of his defense, he includes this description of this supernatural revelation he received where he actually was in the throne room of God, which he, identifies as paradise. Here it is, chapter 12, verse 1 says this: boasting is necessary, though it's not profitable, but I'll go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. And again, he's defending his apostleship here. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body, I do not know, or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. Okay, so these verses here are shrouded in a whole lot of mystery, but just so we're clear, Paul is talking about himself here, okay? All scholars agree he is the man he is referring to that 14 years ago had this experience. And if you keep reading, you'll see that he actually gets to that point where it's made very, very plain. But he admits a couple of times, because there's so much mystery around it, he says, there's some things I can't really describe, and so he doesn't try. He says, I don't really know. I don't know how to explain it. And though he struggled to put his experience into words, he still got the message that this experience was trying to convey to him. And the message that he received, or this vision that he received, it fortified him for the intense periods of suffering that he was going to go through in his ministry. Like this sort of supernatural experience was part of God's unique plan to prepare Paul for his ministry and the difficulties that he was going to go through. Now, if you and I went through something like that, what would be our tendency to respond to that? What would be the most natural response to experience such a phenomenal thing? Like something that nobody on earth had experienced before. Like you're the only one on earth who had ever received a vision or a message like this. The only one who was ushered into God's throne room, the third heaven. How would you be tempted to respond? With a great deal of pride, I would think. Enormous amount of pride. Spiritual conceit of the worst kind. You would be full of yourself. You'd be talking about it all the time, don't you think? But Paul doesn't go there. In fact, it happened 14 years ago. This is the first time he's talking about it. It happened 14 years ago, which was at the very beginning of his ministry, by the way. But an experience like this, it would have a tendency to puff us up. Like, I'm the only one who had this experience before. We'd go on the talk shows. We'd write a book. We would talk all about it. You'd be full of yourself. Brian Regan, the comedian, I don't know if you ever heard of Brian Regan before. He has this bit where he talks about a social fantasy he has where he's one of the 12 people who walked on the moon. And so because of that, in whatever social setting he's in, he can always top someone else's story. So he's at a dinner party and somebody's sharing something, and he's able to say, that reminds me of the time that I walked on the moon. Yeah. Somebody's sharing a story, and he's like, that reminds me of the time I was riding in my lunar mobile in the Sea of Tranquility, And so you're just able to top everybody else's story. That's Paul. He could top anyone's story with the time that he was ushered into the third heaven, paradise, the very throne of God. And that kind of experience would puff you up. Now, God understood the danger of such spiritual pride, and in his grace, he solved the possibility of Paul's pride problem in the form of a painful affliction, which Paul goes on to call a thorn in the flesh. Check it out. Verse 7 of chapter 12. Don't miss this. And because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh. All right, so catch this. On the heels of this supernatural privilege came a physical affliction of throbbing pain for Paul. And what followed this exalted heavenly revelation was an agonizing and humbling earthly suffering. And it was something that would accompany Paul for the rest of his life. For the rest of his life, Paul lived with this thorn in the flesh. Now, what's interesting is that Paul not only understood the nature of the thorn, he understood the reason for it, to ensure a humble spirit in him. Now, what exactly was that thorn? Well, I'll tell you. I don't know. And nobody does. I mean, scholars speculate. There is no shortage of suggestions about what it was. Some say it was a series of spiritual temptations. Some say it was a carnal temptation. Some say, relentless opposition and persecution. Some say physical deformity or epilepsy or migraines or chronic eye trouble or a hunchback or recurring bouts with malaria and the headaches that accompany it. Plenty of speculation for sure, but the truth is we don't know. Nobody knows for sure. Paul, who endured the thorn, called it a messenger of Satan. And certainly the enemy, I'm sure, hoped to use it to cause the Apostle Paul to just throw in the towel with his calling, But God used it to keep this gifted, talented servant humble on his knees. Because a serious difficulty, gang, usually keeps people humble and dependent, even desperate. Now, what's interesting is that Paul tells us on 3 separate occasions that he begged the Lord to remove the thorn from him. He tells us that in verse 8, which we would have done the same, I'm sure. Don't you think? We would have prayed and prayed and prayed and begged and begged and begged for relief. God, please take this pain away from me. Please remove this thorn. Please relieve this. But the Lord didn't. For whatever reason, God did not give Paul the answer to what I think is a reasonable prayer. Paul endured the thorn for the rest of his days and throughout his entire ministry. Now, God did give him another answer. It wasn't the one that Paul was asking for, but it was certainly one he needed. God, instead of relieving the thorn, gave to Paul grace. Sufficient grace. My grace is sufficient for you, he says, for power is perfected in weakness. And that is where the Apostle Paul got his remarkable perspective on human suffering and weakness. It came as a result of 3 repeated pleas for the Lord to remove the thorn. We may think of this as like thorn in the flesh theology, because no was God's final answer to Paul's prayer for deliverance from this suffering. So let me make this observation at this point that might be able to correct some faulty thinking and theology that flies around in our culture and our country, and I'm sure in a room this size. It is not always God's will that you be healed. It is not always God the Father's plan to relieve the pressure in your life, whatever that pressure is. See, our happiness is not God's chief aim. He doesn't have a wonderful, comfortable plan for everybody's life, not from a human perspective. In fact, often his plan is nowhere near comfortable and wonderful. As with Paul, his answer to us and his plan for us is not always what we pray for and ask for. As a follower of Jesus for a long, long time, as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, as a pastor, I have prayed with people and they have been healed, and I have prayed with people and they have not been healed. And that is tough. but remembering that he is forming us more and more into something, into the image of his Son, it really can help us understand that his answer is based on more of a long-range plan and not necessarily our immediate relief and comfort and healing. Now, thankfully, in the midst of the suffering and hardship, like in the middle of the difficulty and struggle, God gently whispers, verse 9 there, my grace is sufficient for you, which means just like Paul, God's grace supplies more than we need to endure whatever it is that threatens to undo us. Like his grace is more sufficient than our strength. His grace is more sufficient than our capacity. His grace is sufficient to carry us through whatever our own unique thorn is. His grace, that's the key. That's the ticket. That's the linchpin. And the reason, and Paul tells us there in verse 9, is because power is perfected in weakness. And this is totally countercultural thinking here. Because we've been taught all our lives that it is our achievements that make us strong, like our accomplishments, our resumes. We've been taught that power is perfected in success. But no, those things, they have a tendency to make us proud and self-sufficient and independent. The painful thorns make us weak. But the good news is when we're weak, God can pour his strength into us, which gives us an entirely new perspective on pain and suffering. Those stresses and the strains that come our way, they drive us to our knees. And at that point, that's when God comes through for us. And so I want to challenge us to stop looking for somebody or something to blame when we go through some difficulty or some hardship or suffering. Instead, we got to understand that suffering is not about identifying the cause. It's really about focusing on the response. And I don't want us to miss this. It's about willingly accepting God's plan no matter the circumstances and finding contentment in God's grace regardless of what we go through. And I want to underscore this again. God's goal is not to make sure that you're happy and comfortable. Like life is not about making you successful and pain-free. Life really isn't about you at all. It's about the Lord. I love how one translation of these verses reads, 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9 says, I quit focusing on the handicap and began appreciating the gift. It was a case of Christ's strength moving in on my weakness. And now I take limitations in stride with good cheer. These limitations that cut me down to size, I just let Christ take over. And so the weaker I get, the stronger I become. Let me give us just a couple of things to keep in mind as we put the wraps on this week's focus, just real briefly. The first thing is this, that every human being will go through seasons and times of suffering and struggle. Everyone. You know, the Bible doesn't promise a pain-free existence. In fact, the oldest book of the Bible, the book of Job, chapter 5, says, for a man is born for trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. And we'd be good to remember that. Instead, the message that gets ingrained in us is that God has nothing but happiness and success in store for us. And especially if we trust him. Like he's supposed to make our life very comfortable. But the Bible doesn't promise that at all. God is not some sort of heavenly Amazon delivery driver, dropping off, nothing but pleasurable and comfortable things on our front doorstep. He doesn't exist to make us happy. We exist to bring him glory, you understand? And we live in superficial, skeptical times. So when some hard thing comes our way, what happens is we end up questioning how a loving God could be so unfair and unjust to us. And I think this is especially true if inside the church, if we consider ourselves somebody who, shows up to church regularly and serves and gives and worships week in and week out, then we think that God owes us. Like that he is to make sure that things work out in our life just so. And so it's easy to get confused about the nature and the character of God and just in the middle of suffering and struggle that comes our way. It was Job who asked, shall we indeed accept good from God, not adversity? I mean, as with Job and Paul, he continues to allow suffering at times to mold us into humble servants. So everybody's going to face seasons like this. So just expect it. Don't be knocked off your place when something comes your way. Another thing to grab onto is we got to resist the temptation to rethink God just because something hard comes to us. When something tragic comes our way, I would just urge us to fight against this draw to impugn God's character. Instead, we got to look deeper and think bigger and cling to him tighter. Like, just refuse to question his motives or his nature. And we got to go back to what the Bible says about his character and nature again and again and again and again. Sometimes God will bring something our way, not because he's cruel or mean or unfair or unjust, and not because he's trying to get even with us or, punish us for messing up or any of the misnomers that we grab onto in the midst of a struggle. Sometimes he's just trying to form us into something. The last thing I'll give us to consider is that we've got to let go of the idea that contentment requires comfort. Contentment is possible no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in. Like years later, after writing 2 Corinthians, Paul wrote to the church at Philippi while in jail, by the way. And he said this, I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. And there it is again, God's strength coming to the forefront in the middle of our weakness. Wouldn't you love to have that perspective? Wouldn't you love to be able to say that about your life? I'm content no matter what. Man, our world needs this. I hope we get there. I hope you get there. We need this so badly. Well, let's go back to the ultimate expression of God's grace, which is what we see in Jesus in his death, burial, and resurrection. The ultimate expression of the grace of God. We do this every week when we come together. We celebrate communion. We take a little piece of bread, a little bit of juice. They're in these individually wrapped packets in the back of the auditorium. If you didn't get one of these, you can grab those here in just a minute. But we take this and we're reminded that a gracious God reaches out to us. And because of this grace through Jesus, we can handle anything. So let's take a few moments. Let's thank God for his grace given to us through Jesus Christ. Let's celebrate communion together.